This morning we're going to continue with our story on the life of Joseph, and we're to the part where Joseph's in prison for a crime he didn't commit. So turn in your Bible, if you would, to the book of Genesis chapter 40. Now, if you're not familiar with the book of Genesis, chapters 40 and 41 explain how Joseph went from being a prisoner to the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. And it's a very interesting story. So what we want to do is we want to take our time as we go through it verse by verse, beginning with verse 1 in chapter 40. Notice what it says. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Notice that verse number 1 begins with the phrase, sometime later. Now, this is a common literary device that's used quite frequently in the Bible, and scholars refer to this literary device as plot retardation. Plot retardation is when an author skips over a large period of time and trivial events in order to get to the main part of the story. Now, let me explain why it's called plot retardation. The word retardation means slow, incomplete, or simple. So if a writer doesn't want his story to be slow, he'll purposely skip over large periods of time and minor events in order to get to the main part of the story. But in doing that, the story is incomplete, and it's a simplified version, hence the name plot retardation. Now, we do the very same thing when we tell a story. How many of you are good storytellers? How many of you are horrible storytellers? Yeah, majority of people are not good storytellers. But normally when we tell a story, we'll make this saying, or we'll say this: to make a long story short. And then we skip over all of the details to get to the main point. People, that's plot retardation. You want to get to the main part, you're going to skip over everything else. Well, the point that I'm trying to make is this. The author of Genesis skipped over large periods of time in Joseph's life, and he skipped over the minor events in order to get to this main part of the story. In fact, the author skipped over 11 years of Joseph's life to get to this part of the story. So let me ask you a question. How old was Joseph at this point in the story? Does anyone know? He was 28. Now, how do we know that Joseph was 28 at this point in the story? Well, we know that he was brought before Pharaoh 2 years after what happened in chapter 40. Look at Genesis chapter 41, verse number 1. It says, 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. And if you remember the story, no one could interpret the meaning of Pharaoh's dream. So Joseph was brought before Pharaoh to see if he could interpret the dream. And of course he could, and he did. But the point I'm trying to make is this. Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream 2 years after what happened in chapter 40. Now, in chapter 41, verse 46, we're told that Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. Look at Genesis chapter 41, verse 46. Now, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So if Joseph was 30 when he stood before Pharaoh, and that was 2 years after what happened in chapter 40, how old was Joseph in chapter 40? 28. 30 minus 2 equals what? 28. Yeah. Now, why is this important? It's important because it tells us that Joseph spent 13 years of his life as a slave and or in prison. 13 years. He was sold into slavery when he was 17 years old. He didn't stand before Pharaoh until he was 30. 30 minus 17 is 13. He spent 13 years of his life as a slave and in prison part of the time. Now, let me ask you a question. Was that a waste of time? For a young man to spend 13 years of his life, from the time he's 17 all the way to he's 30, was it a waste of time for him to be a slave and or prisoner? No, it wasn't a waste at all. Not at all. Listen to me. It's never a waste when you're serving God with all of your heart. And God is using those years to prepare you for His ultimate plan for your life. And we're going to come back to this and make application because the majority of us never reach our full potential. And the reason we don't is because God has a period of time in which He's trying to prepare us for what His ultimate plan for our life is. And we're whistling it away with a bad attitude. And therefore, we're never prepared for the opportunity that God wants to bring our way. But we'll come back to this. Let's get back to the story. Look at verse number 1 again. Some time later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Now, the word offended is translated from the Hebrew word kata, and it simply means to sin. Now, we're not told what sin they committed, but it must have been serious enough to put them into prison, because that's exactly what happened. Look at verses 2 through 5. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he put them in the prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. They remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. While they were in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream one night, and each dream had its own meaning. Now, I want you to notice the last part of verse number 5. It says, each dream had its own meaning. In other words, these weren't normal dreams, these were spiritual dreams, which means that they each contained a prophetical message from God. Now, if you've ever had a spiritual dream, you know it. I've had 2 spiritual dreams in my life, and both times I woke up from a deep sleep, wide awake, and I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that what I had dreamed was a prophetic message from God. I knew that God was speaking to me in those 2 dreams. So the king's cupbearer and the baker had a spiritual dream. And when they woke up, they both knew that there was a prophetic message within their dream that God had given them. They just didn't know what it was, because neither one knew how to interpret their dream. Look at verses 6 through 8. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed that they both looked upset. "Why do you look so worried?" he asked them. And they replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean." "Interpreting dreams is God's business," Joseph replied. "Go ahead and tell me your dream." Now, because Joseph had had spiritual dreams himself, he knew that God never gives a message without also giving the means to understand it. So he said to them, "Tell me your dreams," implying that God would enable him to be able to interpret their dreams. So look at verses 9 through 15. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream first. "In my dream," he said, "I saw a grapevine in front of me. The vine had 3 branches that began to bud and blossom, and soon it produced clusters of ripe grapes. I was holding Pharaoh's wine cup in my hand, so I took a cluster of grapes and I squeezed the juice into the cup. Then I placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." "This is what the dream means," Joseph said. "The 3 branches represent 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as his chief cupbearer. And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well with you. Mention me to Pharaoh, so he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it." Now, the cupbearer's dream was both allegorical and prophetic, which is not surprising because most spiritual dreams are allegorical. I say most because not all spiritual dreams are allegorical, some are literal. In fact, let me give you an example of a dream being literal in the Bible. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Matthew, chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. This is the story of Joseph. If you remember the story, Joseph is betrothed to Mary. But during this betrothal period, they don't live together. They don't have any contact with each other. But he finds out that Mary has become pregnant. And Joseph knows, I haven't slept with her, and she's pregnant. That means she's been sleeping around, or at least sleeping with someone else besides me. And so, being a just man, he's going to put her away privately. In other words, he's going to divorce her. He's not going to bring her out in public and have her stoned, because that's what the Mosaic law requires. So he's getting ready to put her away privately. He's getting ready to divorce her, and that night he has a dream. This is the story. Let's read it. "As he considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. 'Joseph, son of David,' the angel said, 'do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child within her was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and she will have a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins.'" Now, this particular dream was direct and to the point. In fact, there was nothing allegorical about it. It was meant to be interpreted literally. We just have to read it. It means what it says. But as I said, most spiritual dreams are allegorical in nature. Jacob's dream, Joseph's dreams, the cupbearer and baker's dream, Pharaoh's dream, and Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. All of them were allegorical, because most spiritual dreams are allegorical. The 2 spiritual dreams that I had, allegorical. Now, does everyone know what I mean by allegorical? Allegorical simply means that symbolism is used to convey the message. But here's the problem with spiritual dreams that are allegorical in nature. You might know that what you've dreamed has spiritual significance. You might know that it's a spiritual dream. And you might know that God is speaking to you through the dream, so you realize that there's a prophetic message within it. But if you don't know how to interpret the symbolism, you can't discern the meaning of the dream. In both of my dreams, they were allegorical in nature, but when I woke up, God spoke to me and told me what they meant. Had God not done that, I would have known that they had meaning in them and there was a prophetic message within them, but I wouldn't have known how to interpret it. And that was the predicament the cupbearer and the baker were in. They both knew that they had dreamed a spiritual dream. And they both knew that there was a prophetic message within the dream. But they didn't know what it was because they didn't know how to interpret the symbolism. Look at verse 7 and the first part of verse 8. "Why do you look so worried today?" he asked them. And they replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean." So when they woke up, the implication is they knew it was a spiritual dream, so they told people about the dream, but no one knew what it meant. But Joseph knew how to interpret the symbolism. Look at verses 12 and 13 again. "This is what the dream means," Joseph said. "The 3 branches represent. They're symbolic. They symbolize 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as his chief cupbearer." Now, Joseph was so sure of his interpretation that he asked the cupbearer to do him a favor when his interpretation came true. Look at verse 14. "And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so he might let me out of this place." Now, once the baker heard the interpretation of the cupbearer's dream and how good it was, he wanted Joseph to interpret his dream. Hopefully, his dream was going to have a good outcome just like the cupbearer's. You see, he kind of had a nagging suspicion that his dream wasn't good. And because his dream wasn't good, he wasn't sure he wanted to know the interpretation. But when he heard the interpretation of the cupbearer's dream, it was good. Okay, maybe I do want to know. So he said, "Here's my dream." Look at verses 16 through 19. "When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given the first dream such a positive interpretation, he said to Joseph, 'I had a dream too. In my dream there were 3 baskets of white pastries stacked on my head. The top basket contained all kinds of pastries for Pharaoh, but the birds came and ate them from the basket on my head.' This is what the dream means," Joseph told him. "The 3 baskets also represent 3 days. They symbolize. It's an allegorical dream. 3 days from now, Pharaoh will lift you up and impale your body on a pole. Then birds will come and peck away at your flesh." Now, as you can see, the spiritual dream that the baker had was not good. The 3 baskets represented 3 days, but unlike the cupbearer, the baker never saw himself actually actively serving the Pharaoh in his dream. If you remember, the cupbearer, he saw himself squeezing into the cup. He saw himself actively serving the Pharaoh. But the baker doesn't see that. In fact, in his dream, he's never given an opportunity to present his bread to the Pharaoh. Instead, the birds came and they ate the bread off of his head. And of course, these birds were vultures. So here's the interpretation of his dream. In 3 days, the baker would be impaled on a pole, and the birds would come and eat his flesh. Because in those days, just like with Jesus being crucified, you left the bodies on the cross. If you impaled them, you left them there until literally they were nothing but bones, and then the bones would fall apart and fall to the ground. The reason Jesus was taken off of the cross is because he was in the land of Israel, and the Jews required that they be taken down before a holy day or the Sabbath. But you see, his flesh was going to be eaten because they're in the land of Egypt. Now, look at verses 20 through 23. Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later. Now, whenever you see details, you need to make a note of it. Because if the Bible adds a detail there, it's because it's important. Because the Bible uses plot retardation a lot. It skips over things that it considers to be trivial or minor. It will skip over large periods of time. But when it adds something, you need to pay close attention to it. So this is Pharaoh's birthday. Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later. and he prepared a banquet for all his officials and staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join him with the other officials. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position so that he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. But Pharaoh impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had predicted when he interpreted his dream. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. Do you see that? Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. Now later on, when Pharaoh has a spiritual dream and no one's able to interpret it, at that point, the cupbearer remembers Joseph. And he remembered the favor that Joseph had asked of him. So turn to chapter 41, verse 1, and let's look at Pharaoh's dream. We've already covered one whole chapter, chapter 40. Now we move to chapter 41. Notice what it says. 2 full years later. That's important. Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. Now, verse 1 tells us that Pharaoh's dream occurred 2 full years later, or 2 full years after the events in chapter 40. And what happened in chapter 40? The Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker were put in prison, and they each had a spiritual dream on the very same night, but neither one of them knew how to interpret their dream. But Joseph did, and he explained the meaning of the dream. In 3 days, on the Pharaoh's birthday, the cupbearer would be exonerated and restored back to his position. The baker, on the other hand, would be executed and impaled on a pole. And sure enough, 3 days later, on Pharaoh's birthday, Joseph's interpretation of the 2 dreams came true. So, when chapter 41 begins with 2 full years later, it's talking about Pharaoh's birthday. The day that Joseph's interpretation of the cupbearer's dream and the baker's dream came true. So 2 full years later, which would be on Pharaoh's birthday, Pharaoh had a dream. Yeah. Now verses 2 through 7 reveals the dream that Pharaoh had on the night of his birthday, but we're not going to look at the dream. And the reason we're not going to look at the dream at this point in the story is because there's a lot of information that's left out. But the reason it's left out is because the dream is going to be retold again in verses 17 through 24, and it's going to add a lot more details. So we're going to wait until we get there before we read the dream. So let's move on to verses 8 through 14, which explains why Joseph was brought before Pharaoh. Notice what it says. The next morning, the day after his birthday, Pharaoh was very disturbed by the dreams. So he called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. When Pharaoh told them his dreams, not one of them could tell him what they meant. Finally, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. Today I have been reminded of my failure, he told Pharaoh. Some time ago you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. One night the chief baker and I each had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. There was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us what each of our dreams meant. And everything happened just as he predicted. Every detail came true. I was restored to my position as cupbearer, and the chief baker was executed and impaled on a pole. Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes. There's an important detail. We don't have time to look at it today. Maybe we'll get to it next week. But I want you to notice that he shaved. Very, very important part of the story. If the Bible gives it as a detail, take note of it. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh was disturbed by his dream, just as the chief cupbearer and the baker were. And the reason he was disturbed is because he knew that his dream was prophetical. He knew that God had a message for him within his dream. He just didn't know how to interpret it. But neither did his magicians or his wise men. Now, this doesn't mean that they didn't offer an interpretation. In fact, verse 8 implies that they did, but Pharaoh rejected their interpretation. Look at verse number 8 again, except this time we're going to read it out of the New King James Version. All right, notice what the New King James Version says. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. If you notice, that's what kings do. Nebuchadnezzar did the same thing. He called for all of his magicians, his sorcerer, and his wise men when he had this dream. Except Nebuchadnezzar took it a step further. He didn't trust them. What did he do? He said, tell me what I dreamed and then tell me the interpretation. And they go, you're crazy. We can't tell you what you dreamed. Only God can do that. But why did he do that? Because he knew they'd make something up. He knew that they would say, well, the dream means this, and they get all spiritual on him. So the only way that he could make sure that they really knew the interpretation is if they could also tell him what he dreamed. Now, Pharaoh didn't do that. Pharaoh called in his wise men, his magicians, and he said, this is what I dreamed. And they offered an interpretation. Yeah, but he didn't accept it. How do we know that? Well, let's read the King James Version here, New King James Version. Now it came to pass in the morning that the spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams. But there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Now that phrase, for Pharaoh, is very interesting. And the reason it is because it has meaning in the Hebrew. In the original Hebrew, it means that their interpretation of his dream did not satisfy him. In other words, he didn't buy their interpretation. Now, we don't know why he didn't buy their interpretation. We just know that he didn't. So his cupbearer stepped forward, and he told Pharaoh about his experience in prison and how a young Hebrew man had interpreted his dream, and his interpretation came true just as he said it would, down to the very last detail. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph. Look at verses 15 and 16. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I have heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it. It's beyond my power to do this, Joseph replied. But God will tell you what it means and set you at ease. Now, in verse 15, Pharaoh told Joseph that he had heard that Joseph could interpret dreams, which of course wasn't true. So in verse number 16, Joseph corrects the Pharaoh. He says, listen to me, I can't interpret dreams, but God can. And he will interpret your dream through me. In other words, he'll tell me what your dream means, and he'll give you the answer that you seek. Now, I want you to notice how the NIV interprets verse 16. And the reason I say interprets instead of translates is because the NIV is interpretation. If you want a good translation, use the New American Standard. The NIV translates it, but then it says, to make it easier to understand, I'm going to interpret it to mean this. So the NIV is really an interpretation. But here's how the NIV interprets it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Now let me tell you, there's a lot of application in here for us, because we always want to take credit for what God does. If we become successful, it's because of what we've done. No, it's not. It's because God has given you the gifts, talents, and abilities. He's brought the opportunities alone. He has done these works within you to give you the experience you need to succeed. And yet we never want to credit God. If we have this great athletic ability, it's because we're a great athlete. No, it's not. It's because God has blessed you genetically. And you don't have too much up here, so you don't think about it when you do sports. You didn't catch that, did you? You will later. The best athletes are the ones that never think about it. They just act and react without thinking. They're the best athletes. Some of the smartest people, even if they're genetically blessed, they couldn't be a good athlete if they wanted to, because they're always thinking too much. And coaches would say, don't think about it, just do it. Yeah. But here's the thing about Joseph that I want you to see that's so unlike all of us. It's human nature to want to take credit. If God gives you a spiritual gift, you want to take credit for it. But not Joseph. He's the most humble man you would ever meet. He said, I want you to know right away, I can't interpret dreams, but God can. And God will interpret your dream through me. And he'll give you the answers you seek. But I want you to be very clear about this. It's God, not me. So Pharaoh told Joseph his dream. Look at verses 17 through 24. We're finally to the dream. So Pharaoh told Joseph his dream. In my dream, he said, I was standing on the bank of the Nile River, and I saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river, and they began grazing in the marsh grass. That's important, marsh. Where he's at is able to see the delta, the land of Goshen. But then I saw 7 sick-looking cows, scrawny and thin, come up out of them. I've never seen such sorry-looking animals in all the land of Egypt. The thin, scrawny cows ate the first 7 fat cows. But afterwards you wouldn't have known it, for they were still as thin and scrawny as before. Then I woke up. Then I fell asleep again, and I had another dream. This time I saw, and the implication, he's still on the Nile River, the bank of the Nile River, but he's not in the land of Goshen. He's probably around Luxor. I saw 7 heads of grain, full and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were blighted, shriveled, and withered by the east wind. And the shriveled heads swallowed the 7 healthy heads. I told these dreams to the magicians, but no one could tell me what they mean. Now, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but Pharaoh didn't play any active role in his dream. He saw himself in the dream, but he didn't do anything in the dream. He was just standing on the bank of the Nile River watching what was happening. So he was only a passive spectator in his dream. And I personally believe this is why he didn't buy the interpretation of the magicians and the wise men. They were trying to make the interpretation about him. He's the guy that's in charge. And if you want to keep your job, you need to make him feel important. So we're going to stroke him, right? You guys do that. You suck up to your boss, right? Some of you are the best brown nosers in the world. Nothing wrong with that. The Bible tells you you're wise to do that. But that's how these guys were. And so when they give this interpretation, Pharaoh doesn't buy it for a second. And you want to know why? Because he didn't do anything in his dream. He's just watching this. And they're trying to make the dream about him, and he's just a passive spectator in his dream. Yeah. So he knows the dream's not about me. The dream is about Egypt. And he knows that. You see, the word Egypt originally meant black dirt. Our word Egypt comes from the Greek word Aegyptos. Did you know that? Aegyptos means Nile River. But that's not the word that the Egyptians used for their own country. In Egyptian, the word for their country is Kemet. Kemet. And Kemet means black dirt. And it referred to the fertile soil on the banks of the Nile. In fact, most of modern-day Egypt is uninhabited because it's desert. Nothing but sand. I can remember flying to Cairo, Egypt years ago, and as we were descending, all I could see out the window was sand. Not one home. Not one building. No people. Nothing but sand. And then all of a sudden, the city of Cairo appeared, sitting on both sides of the Nile River. Let me show you a map of Egypt. You need to see this. This is from Google Maps. Take a look at this. You see what looks like a blue rabbit there? That's the Red Sea. It branches off. It goes to the Gulf of Aqaba. Wonderful place if you ever get a chance and you go to Egypt. Make sure you go to Jordan. You'll go up the Gulf of Aqaba and you'll be able to see 4 countries from there. But anyways, that's the Gulf of Aqaba. Then the left is the Red Sea, goes into the Suez Canal, and there's Sinai Peninsula. But you see that big green at the top? All right, there's that blue, that's the Mediterranean Sea. That green up there, that's the delta, that goes in the Mediterranean Sea. Below Egypt is Sudan. Now the rain comes and goes to this Nile River, and that green that you see that's just swiggling all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea, that's the Nile River. Now notice that green is all along the side. It's like an oasis right next to the Nile River. But once you get past that, see the rest of it? It's all sand. It's all sand. A few rocks out there too. Yeah. Now, in ancient times, the only part of modern-day Egypt that was inhabited was along the Nile River. Because when the Nile flooded, it brought in this great topsoil from Sudan. Black dirt, which is what Egypt means in Egyptian. So in biblical times, the nation of Egypt didn't extend to its modern-day borders. It was just a thin strip of land that went from modern-day Sudan all the way to the Mediterranean Sea along the banks of the Nile River. The rest was just desert. It's no man's land. No one can live there. So when Pharaoh saw himself standing on the banks of the Nile River, he realized that his dream had national significance. It wasn't about him. It was about the nation that he ruled over, from Sudan all the way to the Mediterranean Sea along the banks of the Nile River. Now, let's look at the interpretation of his dream. Verses 25 through 32. Joseph responded, both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the very same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity. The 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later and the 7 thin heads of grain withered by the east wind represent 7 years of famine. This will happen just as I have described it, for God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterward there will be 7 years of famine, so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having 2 similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God, and he will soon make them happen. Now, the very first thing that Joseph told Pharaoh is that both dreams mean the very same thing. Look at verse 25 again. Joseph responded, both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the very same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do. And in verse number 32, Joseph told Pharaoh why he had 2 different dreams that meant the very same thing. Look at verse 32. As for having 2 similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God, and he will make them happen soon. In other words, you had 2 dreams that means the very same thing in order to let you know that first of all, God has decreed it and nothing can stop it. It will happen. There's not a thing you can do to stop this. God has decreed it. And secondly, it's going to happen very soon, almost immediately. You got to jump on it right now, because if you don't jump on it right now, Egypt's going to be wiped out. So you better make preparation for it. Now, let's look at what God said would happen. First, there would be 7 good years. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain represented 7 years of prosperity. In fact, Egypt's great wealth came from grain and cattle. Most people don't know that. It didn't come from the minerals, it didn't come from the gold, it didn't come from the precious jewels. Those things were shipped in, but the reason they were able to get them is because their great wealth came from grain and cattle. The black dirt along the Nile River produced an abundance of grain, which they shipped to other nations. Here's the most interesting thing. In ancient times, Egypt exported 90% of the grain they harvested. And their grain was so famous, everyone wanted it. In fact, the Romans actually imported the majority of their grain from Egypt. How many of you knew that? Yeah. And the land of Goshen, which is the northern part of Egypt where the Nile branches out, this flows into the Mediterranean Sea. That was perfect for raising cattle. People, this is the land of Goshen. Take a look at this map. See the blue Mediterranean Sea at the top? See that little triangle-like thing that's green? That's the land of Goshen. The Nile River comes in and it begins to branch out, and it's kind of marshland that's there, but it grows the best grass in the world. Now, if you remember this, when Joseph's family comes in, and he says he's going to ask you what you do. Tell him you're shepherds, because they were shepherds, because they despise shepherds. And he'll give you the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen is the best land for cattle. So when they came in, they brought their cattle, they brought their sheep, they brought their goats, and that's where they grew up. Yeah. But here's something bad. When the Pharaoh comes that doesn't know Joseph, he's going to want them to become slaves and make brick. And the best clay and the best straw come from the land of Goshen. Anyways, just want you to understand that about the wealth and prosperity of Egypt. It came from their grain and it came from their animals in the land of Goshen. Now, after the 7 years of prosperity, 7 years of drought would come, producing this great famine. The 7 thin and scrawny cows and the 7 thin heads of grain withered by the desert winds represented 7 years of famine. You see, if the Nile River didn't flood, it wouldn't reach their irrigation channels, so their crops couldn't be watered. And the grass wouldn't grow in the land of Goshen to feed their cattle. So their 2 means of prosperity would be gone. And that's exactly what happened. Now, notice what Joseph told Pharaoh in verses 30 and 31. But after that word, there will be 7 years of famine so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. Now, if you noticed, verse 30 is a repeat of verse 31 is a repeat of verse 30. In other words, it's saying the very same thing. And the reason verse 31 reiterates what verse 30 said is to emphasize the unusual nature and seriousness of this famine. Now, in verses 30 through 36, Joseph advised Pharaoh on what to do. Now keep in mind, Joseph is only 30 years old at this time. 30 years old. Yeah. And here he is advising Pharaoh on what to do. Look at verses 33 through 36. In fact, before we read that, let me just explain the significance of this. Egypt is the major dominant world power at this time. At the time of Joseph, the Assyrian Empire, nah, they're nothing. The Akkadians, they're not a thing. The Babylonians, no. The Medes and Persians, nah. Who's the dominant world power at this time? Egypt. Egypt. And Joseph, at 30 years old, has come into the presence of the most powerful man in the known world. Yeah. And he's going to tell Pharaoh, after he interprets the dreams, he's going to take it a step further. And he says, he's going to tell him what you need to do. Here it is. Verses 33 through 36. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. And let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh. And let them keep food in their cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. Now, you might not have picked this up, but Joseph made 3 recommendations. The first one is found in verse 33. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. In other words, you need to choose one man to be in charge over all of Egypt. And all the activities of the state need to be under his control. All activities, everything, one man. You make him your steward, and he'll be in charge. So this man needs to be very intelligent, and he needs to be very wise. Because he's going to be the second most important man in the world. Who's the most important man? Pharaoh. He is going to be the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. The second recommendation is found in verse 34. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. In other words, the man you put in charge needs to have a staff that's underneath him in order to prepare Egypt for the future famine. They need to levy a tax of 20% of all the grain that's harvested during the 7 years of prosperity, and to make sure that it's collected and stored for use during those 7 years of famine. The third recommendation is in verses 35 and 36. It says, and let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish, that your nation won't be wiped out during the famine. Now this third recommendation is super smart. Man, there's so much wisdom in this. You see, the normal tax on the people at that time was 10%. How do you know that, Pastor Allen? Because we actually have hieroglyphics that tell us what they taxed. Look back during those time periods, and what the Pharaoh normally took from the people was 10%. But during the 7 years of prosperity, they were going to double the tax, which meant that the people weren't going to be very happy. So to help alleviate their anger, Joseph recommended that they keep the grain that they collected in the same city that they collected it from. Look at verse 35 again. Notice what it says. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of the Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Not city singular. Not Luxor, where the palace is. Not Memphis, which was another royal city. Not any other city, but cities, plural. In other words, he said you need to store the grain you collect in the same city that you collect it from, so the people can see where it's going. That way, when you tell them that the Pharaoh had a dream of a future famine coming, and you're saving the grain that's being collected for use during the famine, then they'll see that it's being saved for them. And they might gripe, but they won't rebel. People, that was super smart. Because he knew if you just took 20%, they go, yeah, sure. The king's taking it for his personal use. But if they take the grain they collect and they put it in the very same city where it was taken from, they go, well, maybe this isn't for the king. It looks like they are storing this up. Now, here's what's interesting if you study archaeology or read about archaeology. Do you realize that in almost every ancient city they have found these large storage buildings with grain, thousands of years old. They built these storage facilities for the grain, and it verifies the story of the Bible. So, Joseph not only interpreted Pharaoh's dream, but he also told Pharaoh what to do to save Egypt from being wiped off the face of the earth. Now let's make some application. How did Joseph become so wise? In other words, how did Joseph know what Egypt needed to do to prepare for the coming famine? Because after all, he was only 30 years old at the time. Was his wisdom supernatural? Did God give him the interpretation of the dream, but then also in the interpretation of the dream, give him the knowledge of what Pharaoh needed to do? Well, if God did, the Bible doesn't say that. In fact, the Bible downplays that part. And it plays the part where Joseph was this wise man. He's the one that knows what to do, and that wisdom came from him. So how in the world did Joseph become so wise at the age of 30? Well, instead of griping and complaining when something bad happened to him, he used it as an opportunity to learn and grow. In fact, Joseph had 13 years of training, 13 years of education. And he used his position in every place he was at to not only gain knowledge, but to hone his skills. He used his position as the recipient of the birthright to learn how to manage and delegate, especially to delegate to people who didn't like you and wouldn't speak peaceably to you. When he was sold into slavery, he rose to the position of the master steward in Potiphar's house. And there he honed his management and administrative skills, and everything that he did prospered. And because he was the captain of the guard, he was not only over his palace, but he was also over the prison, the workers in the field, the household servants, and all the money that came and went. And then he was thrown into prison. In prison, he rose to a position of trustee over all of Pharaoh's political prisoners. And again, he used that time and he used that position to further hone his skills. So when he got the opportunity to go before Pharaoh, he not only had the ability to interpret the dream, but he had the wisdom and the confidence to say, and this is what you need to do now that you know the interpretation. Now, let me give you a principle that you need to know if you want to be prepared when an opportunity for promotion arises. Are you ready to write this down? It's not going to come on the screen. I decided not to highlight this, so you'd have to listen. Are you ready to write it down? Here goes. There is always a period of time between being anointed for a job and actually being appointed to the job. Wow. Let me say that again. There is always a period of time between being anointed for a job and being appointed to the job. And if you use that time wisely to hone your skills, you'll be ready when that opportunity arises. If you don't use that time wisely to hone your skills, you won't be ready when the opportunity comes along. Now listen to me, because this is very important. The time period between being anointed for a job and being appointed to the job is a time of preparation. And 9 times out of 10, it's a period of setbacks, hardships, and disappointments. But that is what is needed to prepare you for what God has in store for you, what God has in store for your life. Most of us don't realize. So in that period of time, instead of taking advantage of it, we gripe and complain. And we make comments like this. Well, it didn't do me any good to do what the Bible says. It didn't do me any good to do the right thing. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm just going to do my job and nothing more. Oh, yeah. 90% of humans do that. It's always someone else's fault. Not realizing that this could be part of God's plan to prepare you for the great plan He has for your life. So guess what? During that time that you're griping and you're complaining, you're not gaining the experience that you need or the knowledge you need to succeed in the next phase of your life, to succeed in the opportunity that God is getting ready to bring your way. Joseph had 13 years to prepare for the position of vizier, the second most powerful position in Egypt, which also meant the second most powerful position in the entire world at that time. And when he got the opportunity, he was ready. Most people wouldn't have been because they have a victim mentality. You want to know what's wrong with America today? We're not building our country on biblical principles. I read something very disturbing this week. 62% of the population between 18 and 34 believe that socialism is better than capitalism. 62% of those between the ages of 18 to 34 believe that socialism is better than capitalism. Now, I'm snarky, and you still love me, right? If you think that way, you're a loser. And I'm going to explain why. Are you ready to write this down? If you believe in socialism, it means that you don't have the ability to succeed with the opportunities that you've been given. Let me say it again. It means you believe you don't have the ability to succeed with the opportunities you've been given. We live in the greatest country in the world, and I'll tell you why we do. It's not because we're America, and we're Americans, and we always think that we're the best. It's because this country was based on Judeo-Christian values, and capitalism comes from the Bible. The reason thou shalt not steal is part of the 10 Commandments is because God gave man the ability of ownership. You can't steal from someone who doesn't own it. You can only steal from someone who owns it. God says, thou shalt not steal. He gives man the right to own. But not only that, God gives man the right to take advantage of every opportunity that comes his way. We live in America, people. But parents are not doing their job. And the reason they're not doing their job is because they are not allowing children to suffer hardship. They are not allowing their children to suffer setbacks. They are not allowing their children to suffer disappointments. And that is a part of life. And instead of trying to rescue them from that, they need to be telling them, this is part of life. And in this time, you can either have a bad attitude and a victim mentality and say, life's not fair. Or you can realize life is not fair because we live in a wicked, sinful world. But God is good, and He will work all things together for good to those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. If you have a good attitude and you realize this might not be fair, this might be bad, this might be a hardship, this might be a setback, this might be a disappointment, but God is using this to hone my skills for the day that He has for me to rise to the position I'm supposed to be. That's what Joseph did. Now, I'm big into time. Joseph was 30 when this happened. He said it's going to happen almost immediately. We don't know if it happened that year, but I would say so because the dream was 2 dreams, and it meant that God had decreed it, but it was going to happen soon. So I think that after he'd said that, immediately prosperity happened for 7 years. He was 37 at the end of that prosperity. And then 7 years of drought came. And I'd say about into the 3rd year, we'll get to the story. That's when people from other countries have to start coming to Egypt to buy food. They didn't know about the drought that was coming. They didn't make preparation for it. They had no idea. Which means that Joseph would have been about 40. And his brother, Reuben, is 6 years older, is 46. And Joseph hasn't seen his brothers since he was 17. And he's now 40. 23 years have passed, and they don't recognize him. But what we're going to find is Joseph had no bitterness in his heart. And the reason he didn't is because he loved God and he was called according to his purpose. And God was able to use him. Some of you need to get rid of that victim mentality and realize you're a child of God. And if you're not, you need to accept Jesus and become a child of God. And then you need to look at where you're at. And if you're in the middle of this period of time where it's a hardship, it's a setback, it's a period of disappointment, you realize that God is using that to prepare you for the opportunity that's going to come in the near future.